of drawing this parallel with the First World War, which is a kind of accident of events which came together, with the common denominator in 2023 of Russia fighting in Syria, with Iran and China being their allies, and with Russia fighting in Ukraine. The idea that these independent situations might be drawn together for a third world war.
Yes, I think you've drawn together the complicated web that we weave today in international relations. And I think it was put well to me once by a former director of the CIA who said the world has been more dangerous in the past. For example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the world could have gone up in smoke at that moment, but it's never been more complicated. And it's principally complicated today because we face a challenge here in the free world from the forces of the unfree world, who are increasingly working together with one another to try and take on the international system as it exists and also to overturn it. And Russia is at the heart of this. And we've seen what Russia has done, of course, in Ukraine, where it has gone over the border into a sovereign nation, trying to effect a land grab and a change of government there, which it hopes to achieve still. We can see, obviously, that relationship between Russia and China expanding in terms of the commonality that they see themselves as fighting against the forces of the free world. And it links through to the Middle East, the Gaza situation, not only in Syria, as you mentioned, but also through Hamas, of course. And because, there's sort of evidence that Hamas was trained in part by some Russian trainers, but crucially, the Iranian context as well, where Iran, don't forget, is supplying drones to Russia to fight in Ukraine and is, of course, relying on Russian support in some way to keep its position in the Middle East. So everything is tied together, as you rightly pointed out, and one thing can quickly lead to a giant conflagration.
And I'm going to add the ch word in here, it's China, because in the sudden American vacuum, which is now being filled by the Biden administration quick as lightning, is that it was China that started brokering deals with Saudi Arabia. It has its massive oil deal. So China was looking to be more of an influence in the Middle East. We know, don't we, before the pandemic, that China was heavily involved in investing in Israel's ports as well. And in the last death throes of the Trump administration, there was an emergency meeting, wasn't there, between Trump's team and Benjamin Netanyahu to say, look, you've got to ease up on China's investment in Israel, because the Chinese Belt and Road kind of policy of investing around the world is to wait for countries to go bankrupt and then they take control of the ports, isn't it? So these are very serious imperial issues as the world, which was globalized, is now becoming factionalized.
Well, yes, it's ironic, isn't it, that globalization should have led, if you like, to this kind of outcome where we're now breaking apart into multipolar levels. Look, on the one hand, what you've said is absolutely correct. The Chinese in particular are looking to expand their influence wherever they can get an opportunity economically through the Belt and Road Initiative, buying up infrastructure, trying to put in loans at crazy prices in order to ultimately seize things when the countries concerned can't pay. And the Chinese will see an opportunity. If they see, for example, the Americans resiling from an area like the Biden administration was doing from the Middle East before recent events, they will try and step in and broker, as you say, a deal between, say, the Saudis and the Iranians, because they'll go, we're here, the Americans aren't. We're trying to show a position of power this way. And of course, the Chinese are watching more generally, aren't they? Because they're looking at what's happened in Russia, Ukraine, and what's happening in the Middle East today to determine just how far America in particular will go to defend the free world, because they do, of course, covet the return of Taiwan as they see it. And we've had a constant fear over the last year there might be a conflict breaking out between China and Taiwan that could very easily bring the USA into it as well. And before you know it, you've then got conflicts all over different spheres of the world. And, the opportunity then for a giant conflagration is increased just further.
Let's talk geopolitically here about China here, because its independent countries in the Far East have made a choice to be pro-Western, to be pro-American. The Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, etc. Japan, of course. But there is one that isn't. And of course, we talk about North Korea, but that is a positive, isn't it? The idea that those independent nations in that part of the world are very much part of the Western alliance rather than China. And that's not going to change, is it?
No, 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 not at all. I mean, what's fascinating, as you've just pointed out, is that China's neighbours, the countries, if you like, that know China the best, are terrified of China and its ambitions. And if you look at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the others that you mentioned in consideration, they are mostly interested in stopping China's influence from expanding because they're fully aware that the first people who China are likely to eat up are its neighbours. And as a result, they are very keen to preserve their own ways of life, their own freedoms in some cases, but in other cases, just how they are doing things and not come under any further influence from China. And instead, indeed, to hitch their wagon, as many have done for many years, to the US security idea and the fact that the Pacific should be a free ocean, the Indian Ocean should be a free ocean, that people should be able to trade without fear of China kind of interfering and intervening in politics or economics. And that is why, if you like, that American model continues to appeal to China's neighbours because they see the alternative and they're having none of it.
So when we were kids, Alan, America was the world's policeman. And suddenly they got a little bit perturbed by the multipolar world, which has been created a little bit, actually, by their own intransigence. And we've seen that in the Middle East, how they have withdrawn their interests and suddenly they found actually that they still need to be the world's policeman. I had a long chat with Tim Marshall, that geopolitical expert, and he says that reports of America's demise are somewhat overstated, and that if America was more assertive in its foreign policy, then actually it could continue to influence the world in a way that it used to in the Ronald Reagan era and before.
Yes, I would agree with that. The reality is America does go periodic bouts of self-doubt about whether it should be doing this, whether it makes sense for it to be doing this. In reality, for both America and the world, the only thing worse than America exercising its power is America not exercising its power. And that's been proven many times over the years as to what happens when the US withdraws. It's not good for the Americans ultimately, and it's not good for everyone else who relies on the way the international order has been established since 1945, which does at the end of it, kind of depend on American might and American determinism to go there. But this is why I always felt it was, kind of ironic when people were saying that, Trump's America First philosophy would necessarily lead to an American isolationism. On the contrary, Americans have found for years that when they withdraw, and go that that's the America First idea, the world comes, knocks on their door and causes trouble for them instead. So the actual irony of America First is, yes, the international system works for the Americans. That's why it makes sense for the Americans to go out and be its most robust defenders. And were they to do what they did in the Reagan era and come back in a strong way, I think they'd find countries flocking to their banner in support. Countries would, they need some encouragement here, but would pay their fair share in defence spending and beyond to assist America in that sort of defending of the international order. But the alternative, frankly, is chaos, it is disunity, it is suggesting that Russia and China might be better arbiters of the international system than America, and that, frankly, is in nobody's interest, least of all America's.
So, Alan, where does this leave Blighty in the world today? Now, obviously, we've had a few too many prime ministers in recent years to be cohesive, and foreign ministers about our foreign policy. And of course, we've had Brexit, which has, in theory, made us more independent with our foreign policy, or at least it should have done. Obviously, we are best friend with the United States. We share the language, we share it, well, usually, and we share a lot of intelligence. But we're, how significant, I think, even though Britain is a leading world economy, how significant is Britain in terms of its diplomacy around the world?
Well, it's good you raise this, Johnny, because actually it's important we have this sort of conversation front and centre. The reality is that the greatest self-deprecators of their role in the world is the British themselves. We are absolutely uncertain about how the rest of the world sees us. And in actual fact, on my travels around the world as part of my international relations focus, I am constantly surprised and amazed and pleased to see the high esteem in which British diplomacy is held by countries around the world, by how other countries want to see Britain front and centre of diplomatic solutions, of sort of bolstering the free world, acting in support of what they themselves want. And there's a sort of, if you like, a moral clarity Britain always has that others want to follow. And, we're the last to realise this, but in reality, there is a huge role still for the UK, given its history, given its diplomatic heft in the world, our UN Security Council seat,
right,
our military capabilities. All these things tell you that the UK is still a first-rank power. The only thing that's stopping us is our own, if you like, inability to grasp this and to go forward and take things. Yes, of course, there are things we should be doing more of. We need to spend more on defence ourselves. That's quite true. But actually, we start from a much better position than most countries in terms of how we're viewed around the world. And, we're not making the most of those relationships. And it's about time that we started looking at the idea of, the return of a global Britain with global aspirations, because I can tell you this, there are many countries out there that would welcome it rather than, sort of suggest that we should stay in our corner. So, it really is incumbent on our politicians to seize this moment, get out there and wave that flag, not for pointless sake, but because people want to work with us, and we're always very good at working with them.
I think that's a really, really good statement. Thank you for that, Alan, which then, if we go into central casting and we're looking for a foreign secretary with a bit of heft, we're looking for an English gentleman, someone who represents British life. I mean, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton, even the name he's chosen, is sort of, perfect English, isn't he? He looks the part, and he is world famous in a way, with all due respect to James Cleverly, even though he did a good job and he was always on side, it didn't. And again, Boris Johnson kind of added that heft as well with his historical knowledge of previous conflicts. I always think he speaks with great detail on military issues, on diplomatic issues. Boris, that's kind of his specialised subject. But Lord Cameron looks the part, doesn't he? And as a former Prime Minister in this job, is an important new showroom Britain, isn't he, for this country?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it might have been a bit unfair to say that about James Cleverly, actually, who is quite actually an imposing figure.
Yes. He did a good job. I always liked the way he spoke,
yeah,
but he's not quite as famous, is he?
No, he's not as famous in that sense. But look, at the end of the day, whoever's in that role, they are, if you open your passport, you'll see this, they are His Britannic Majesty's Secretary of State, basically. And they carry, if you like, the imprimatur of Britain's history and Britain's diplomatic heft, and they carry that with them, basically. But you're right, at the moment, if you look at someone like Lord Cameron, who's had the experience, obviously, of being the Prime Minister, of having been on the world stage for 6 years already, in that sense, that cannot but be a boon to British diplomacy and Britain getting things done, if, of course, he's allowed to get things done. Frequently, we see, that there are domestic matters that take priority, and as a result, we're not necessarily as effective as we could be on the world stage. I think having someone of David Cameron's experience there means that you're going to see a big focus on foreign policy, a big focus on getting things done, because I doubt he would have accepted a return to cabinet on the premise that he should simply look nice at global photo shoots. I think he's there to get a job done. He's got the experience to get a job done, and that's a promising start to any politician's career in a new office. And this is obviously a key one, given what opportunities exist for Britain in the world today.
Dr. Alan Mendoza is the Executive Director of the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you very much for joining us. More of Alan in just a moment, and your texts and tweets most appreciated in real time, and we will ask these questions. There's a new president of Argentina who looks a bit of a firebrand, doesn't he? President Milei, who's promised that he'll get the Falklands back. Oh, no. Hi, Johnny. We must not